everyone. Christ is in our midst. It's good to see you all here in class and online this evening. We are beginning the third section of our book study on Job, The Trial of Job by Father Patrick Henry Reardon. We're starting with chapter 12, and we'll be hopefully working through chapter 15 tonight. And for those of you who are online, but know others who might be interested, but aren't on Facebook, I've started uploading these videos to our new YouTube account. So you should be able to find them there as I upload them. I know the first two sections are up, and I should have 3 and 4 up this week. So you can find them there as well if it's easier to watch there, or if you know others who'd be interested but aren't on Facebook. So without further ado, we will jump right in to our class. And we will begin with chapter 12. Starting with the beginning of chapter 12, what does Job know that his comforters do not?
The power of God.
Job knows the power of God. That is certainly true. Turn this up. What else?
Job knows that he's innocent.
Job knows that he's innocent. Job also knows that there is a mystery involved in his suffering. Right there at the beginning of the second paragraph. Unlike his 3 friends, Job knows there is a mystery involved in his sufferings, and he endeavors to identify it. What is the mystery that Job wants to identify?
To know why, I guess he doesn't know why it happens to him so far.
You want to know why?
Yeah. So
He wants to know why, and his particular suffering, his particular experience points to a deeper question and a more abstract question, a question about things in general. And what is that question?
Do the just suffer?
Do the just suffer? So all along, the contention of his comforters has been that Job must have done something wrong because God punishes the unrighteous and blesses the righteous. And this, of course, is a theme that you see sprinkled throughout Scripture. So it isn't an unfounded notion. However, Job is going to point out, just from the experience that they all have, that it is sometimes the case, and I'm sure he knows that each of his comforters is thinking of somebody in particular. It's sometimes the case that the unrighteous prosper. You know, we all know of a situation, he's saying to his friends, where someone who is unrighteous, we know they deal falsely, their scales are weighted manipulatively, or they've been dishonest in their trade, or they're cruel to their servants. We all know somebody like that, and yet they prosper. So, if the unrighteous sometimes prosper, is it possible that sometimes the just or the righteous also suffer? And this seems to be something that his comforters just not only have not considered, but really do not even want to consider. And if you have the worldview that if I'm righteous and good and obey all the rules, God will bless me and I won't suffer, you wouldn't want to consider it either.
Yeah.
How does Father Patrick distinguish between the manner in which Job's comforters think they are speaking, and the truth of the matter?
This is a good question.
I'll answer it. Okay. His comforters don't know any more than he does.
Right?
Okay.
There's more.
That's all I got.
They think they speak for God.
They think they speak for God. They are absolutely sure that they are not only saying what is true, but that they are speaking to him with the voice of God, calling him to repentance. How does Job describe the way that they're speaking? And Father Patrick elicits very nicely what Job says. It seems to be in passing. In other words, Job says what he says, but Father Patrick pulls it out and gives an extra sentence or two that really helps you to get a greater sense of it here. In the fourth paragraph down on page 43. So his comforters think that they're speaking for God, and that they know the facts of the matter, and there's no question. Excuse me. Excuse me. So his comforters don't think that there's any mystery at work here. There's nothing to be sussed out. It's just a matter of Job coming to his senses and straightening up and saying he's sorry. And they speak for God in this way. So they speak with absolute confidence, the confidence of divine authority. Job says that it's a totally different kind of conversation that they ought to be having, and that he, in fact, is having with God. And it's more like, Job says, testing various recipes. That you are tasting and adjusting, that you're getting a feel for what's going on here, like someone tries out various words as they're writing something or singing or making a song, or as a cook tries out various recipes to get it just right. There's a lot of probing, exploring, testing, which is a very different sort of thing. It lacks the certitude, the confidence, the absoluteness of the way his comforters are approaching. He's approaching it with a questioning, exploratory kind of perspective. And that goes back to the fact that Job insists that there is a mystery involved here, something that none of them understand, that they're trying to figure out, or at least that Job is trying to figure out. And they are simply trying to get him to cook a grilled cheese the way that they know Mama said you ought to cook a grilled cheese.
That reminds me of being in a catechumen. You're supposed to taste and see.
Mm-hmm.
And you gather the information.
And you're exploring, you're feeling it out. This is what Job is doing at any rate. Job is trying to discover something that he does not understand and does not know. His comforters are just trying to solve the problem that Job has become. What is the great moral offense of Job's comforters?
Go ahead.
They blame him for his suffering. They castigate him for that. And they say that he's being arrogant. All names.
They blame him. They accuse him. But Father Patrick says that the great cruelty of it all is that they do it from the vantage point of their ease. They aren't suffering. They aren't at a loss. And he is. And so from the vantage point of their relative comfort, they feel that they have permission to come down on him like a pile of bricks. And he says that's their great wickedness, is that they have this privilege of not being in this terrible suffering. And they use it to pile on. Moving on to chapter 13. How does Father Patrick characterize the difference between the way Job and his comforters speak concerning God?
I think you covered that before. Job talks to God and the others talk for God.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Job talks with God and the others speak for God. This is something that's worth attending to, and there are a lot of themes that we're going to come to over and over. You know, we've already done this a number of times. There are a lot of themes that play out over and over again in the book. And on one level, it's because you're dealing with the comforters, particularly who are locked in. They are not changing much. They are pretty rigid, pretty static. But on another level, it's because it's as we rehearse these same themes from slightly different angles over and over again that we come more deeply to internalize those lessons, that we come more deeply to understand those things, and that we can then draw something from that. We state the lessons over and over from slightly different vantage points, and maybe after a while we begin to absorb them. Because these are not purely historical lessons about some other people and their stupidity in some other time. It's easy enough for me to see here ways that we do the same things. How quick we are to speak for God. And one thinks of people who famous television evangelists or preachers who say X hurricane is because of Y sin that we committed, or that other people, usually it's other people, it's never us, it's always somebody else committed. This happened because of that, or, if you do this, then God will give you that. Speaking with the voice of God, speaking for God.
Normal people do that too. They say California has all these fires because they're so wicked. The movie industry and all that.
All right. It's a great tendency to want to speak for God.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think we're so tempted to do that?
Ego.
Ego? Gives us a sense of power,
Mm-hmm.
authority. It makes us feel superior. Everybody loves to feel righteous. And you see this now a lot, in a lot of different ways. Everybody loves to find somebody that they can kick because they're a hypocrite, or because they're bad, or because they don't, whatever it happens to be. And it's not so much that you want to right a wrong, it's that you get to feel righteous. And then your anger and your violence is excusable. So you get to be really angry and feel good about it at the same time. As opposed to, say, being really angry and feeling really guilty about it later because you were drunk and said really stupid things, You don't usually feel good about that later. You feel embarrassed about it later. But if you can feel like you're righteous, like you're condemning some moral evil, then you get to feel all that good, juicy, angry feeling, and you get to mete it out on somebody else. I mean, you really get to lay them out rhetorically, and then you don't have to feel bad about it later because you are just standing up for what is right. And that feels really good to people. Of course, most of the time it's a terrible sin. But we have this great tendency to want to speak for God. And it's one we ought to be kind of cautious about. Much better, at least according to Job, to speak with God. Because at the end, as we know, God will come and will talk with Job, and all the people who have been speaking for him he is not too pleased with. And he says that Job will then have to intercede on their behalf. So maybe we should take a lesson about that. How does Job characterize the speech of his comforters?
speak wickedly for God.
They speak wickedly for God. And why is that? Why is their speech wicked?
They discredit the Almighty by denying the subtlety of the divine wisdom.
They discredit the Almighty by denying the subtlety of divine wisdom. Can you all suss that out? Say any more about it?
They speak too rashly, too quickly, too presumptuously.
And they all assume, to some degree, and the degree, it is a spectrum. Zophar is the most extreme, and Eliphaz is the most subtle. But they all speak from the vantage point that God works mechanistically. He's like a law of nature. Do X, get Y. Input, output. It's always the same. It's always predictable. There's no sense of relationship, as though God is personal in any way, that God is a being. And Job has this relationship with God. He relates to Him as friend. He speaks with Him as one speaks with a friend, even a friend one is angry with or wounded by. But that's how He treats Him. And all of his comforters, to a degree, they treat God like a force of nature. And that's a big reduction, in a certain sense. It's a big diminishment of who God is. God is this impersonal force of nature. You don't want to know Him. You don't need to know Him. You just need to do the thing and get the result. And this is to diminish tremendously who God is. It's to deny His being in an essential way. There is no being with God, just rules.
It's an interesting comparison, that hard determinism compared with Jesus in the garden, when it's the Father's foreknown will that Christ go to the cross, and yet there's this wrestling back and forth, with the Father's will, and compared with that, just a hardcore determinism that you find in some philosophies and world religions.
Absolutely, and there's a relationship that is embodied in that discussion. Father, if it be your will, let this pass from me. He speaks out of His human will, knowing already in His divine will what the will of the Father is, but showing in this how the human will conforms to the Father, but going through this wrestling process nonetheless. All of that is just gone with the comforters. And the picture of God that emerges is not personal. It's not relational at all. It's just a set of rules to follow, and an impersonal divine force to be obeyed. And so all of the humanity is stripped out, in the sense of a leaning into, of a trying to understand God, of a growing toward Him. It's all gone. There's none of that there. How much less their vision of God is. How much reduced. How cold. It's very cold.
Is that due because there are more primitive people, like the Mayans and Aztecs, that sacrificed people to a God that was not, your friend? And it was just like a mechanism, like you're talking about, that it might have been the overwhelming feeling of the time. They were not...
Well, so there are a couple of different things at play here with that. In a lot of ancient religions, older forms of Greek polytheism, older forms of Roman polytheism, South American religions and things of that nature, that the God is very personal, but in a capricious way. And He can be angered, He can be flattered, He can be enticed, He can be threatened. Of course, that's always dangerous. But appeasement is a big part of the relationship that one has with those gods. So the God is very personal, but very capricious and unpredictable. And so there are all kinds of things you have to do to try to keep your. He's like an alcoholic father. You know, you have to learn all these tricks to do, when to tiptoe and when to move in, when to back off. You have to manage all these tricks to have a relationship with him to get what you want or what you need and to avoid what you don't want. That's the way a lot of those other religions. Here, it isn't so much that God is capricious, it's that God is completely impersonal. That all you have to do is just follow the rules, check the right boxes, and everything goes right. And if you accidentally check the wrong box, then all you have to do is just, do the thing you've got to do to get back on the right footing again, and everything goes back because it just happens like clockwork. So it's completely denuded of a personal dimension at all. And that, I think, is what Father Patrick is getting at and what Job is getting at. And the wickedness of their speech is that they're totally stripping out that whole dimension of who God is and of how we relate to him. Job doesn't need a friend if they're right. Job's personal relationship with God means nothing. It's a waste of time, and it's probably just a delusion. And so this is the wickedness of their speech. Job feels his suffering must have some sensible explanation. Why does he feel that?
And some of this goes back to the previous chapter too, that all of humanity really cries out for some purpose and meaning to how we suffer, and why is there evil in the world. And just the powerful beauty of this is that the God of the Bible answers that question. It's not just a mechanical worldview or hard determinism, and that even if we suffer, God has some purpose. And so we look for that. And I think he says Job kind of yearned for that in his suffering, that what does this mean? And I think it's really a basic human urging that we have.
Job is absolutely expressing this deep need that humans have for there to be meaning in the world. But what's the alternative? It says it right here, the last full paragraph on the page. Job knows in an absolute sort of way that more is happening in his life than meets the eye. If this were not the case, Job is sure his sufferings would be senseless. And that's the alternative that Job abhors, is this notion of a chaotic universe where nothing means anything, where everything is just random and senseless and causeless. That's what Job sees over the horizon. He knows that he's innocent. And he's sure that there must be some sense in it. He doesn't understand it. He doesn't know why. But the only alternative to that conviction is that nothing makes any sense and that everything is senseless. And that is just that he does not want to go there at all.
Nihilism.
It is. I mean, that's where it leads us to this. Is to nihilism. It's an ugly, scary sort of place to go at the end of it.
The existentialists, once they lost God, the atheistic existentialists, once they lost God, that was their real crisis, and so their answer was to, everybody just create their own meaning. But that's never enough. There has to be a God with some real ontological status who is really there. And even if we don't know the reason for why we suffer, we know he is there and he is always good.
Job is sure that God is there. He doesn't understand, but he knows in his being that there is something still happening here. And that's that apocalyptic principle that there's more going on than he understands, more going on than meets the eye. What is driving Job toward a true understanding of what's happening to him?
pain and suffering. And he says, afflictions in his flesh.
It's at the very end there. What he experiences in his heart, the pain in his heart, the pain and suffering he's experiencing internally is what drives him on. The pain in the flesh is bad. I mean, in the sense that it hurts. It's a kind of crisis in and of itself. But it's the internal pain that can't be resolved simply by healing in time. The wounds of the flesh heal up, sores go away, but the pain in the heart can stay just as vivid, just as powerful, and that drives him on toward finding something to heal that.
Viktor Frankl, it's a book called something about meaning, but concentration camp survivor.
Mm-hmm.
His main point was that if you don't have purpose, you can't survive the suffering.
Absolutely.
And that's all interior work. It's not about what's out there, it's about how it affects what's in here.
Right.
And that search for meaning is what that's your lifeline. If he doesn't hold on to that, despair and death, that's what takes over. This search for meaning to find the healing for that interior wound is what propels him forward. So moving on to chapter 14. Are there any other comments about chapter 13 or chapter 12? If not, we'll move on to chapter 14. What is the hope that Job expresses in this chapter?
And this is something I had a question about.
Mhm.
He's talking about rising from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
And you think that this is a Christian thought. We're going to rise from the dead. Yet he's talking about rising from the dead. I guess when eternity ends or something, he has a word for it in there. When heaven is dissolved,
Mm-hmm.
he will rise again. Just what does that mean when heaven is dissolved?
It's interesting. You definitely see, and Father Patrick points out in this chapter that humans seem to have wired into them a deep need or a deep intuition that life somehow ought to continue beyond the grave. That death ought not to be like the end of everything. There's this intuition that somehow that ought to be true, or that needs to be true. And it gets fleshed out in a whole lot of different ways. Reincarnation, or Hades in Greek mythology, which is not the bad place. It can be a lot of different kinds of places, but it's the place where pretty much everybody goes. Valhalla, all these different kinds of ways that intuition gets expressed, but it's a very deep intuition. And in Judaism, it's one that you see grow over time. It gets very little mention in the early part of Jewish history and in the early Jewish literature. By the time you get to the later prophets, to the post-Babylonian exile stuff, to the intertestamental period, by the time you get to the Maccabees, you have a not universally accepted, but very full-throated expression of the belief that there is a life after death, and that the dead will rise, that God will raise the dead. So when you get to the Maccabean martyrs, this is very clearly affirmed, that the dead will rise, that God will raise them to new life. But this is not constant. This is an intuition that grows as the tradition moves through time historically. And here you see in Job, you see it in an earlyish kind of form. The intuition is very strong with Job that somehow this must be or ought to be. He doesn't have any way of articulating what exactly it would look like or how it works, who qualifies or anything like that. But just this deep intuition that it should be, that God, the dead don't just end in the grave. So he has this sense, and he's going to express it in a kind of a limited way. But this is what you see happening in the tradition, that this sense is growing over time. And that by the time you get to the intertestamental period, it's very strong. And by the time you get to the New Testament, it's become a matter of extraordinary contention. The Pharisees and the Sadducees are divided specifically on this issue. Matter of fact, Paul plays them off with each other. When he's called to trial for his Christian troublemaking, he has this little brainwave, and when he's put on trial, he says, "I'm on trial here because I believe in the resurrection of the dead." And in this really lovely comic moment right there in the book of Acts, the whole courtroom erupts in argument right there in front of him, which is what would happen with Jewish or Greek people. They start arguing. They start arguing right there and right then. What? The resurrection of the dead? This is ridiculous. Paul, you've lost your mind. Everybody knows that this isn't true. What? No, Paul is right. Paul speaks the truth here. Listen to them. You know, it's this chaotic scene, like that scene at the end of A Miracle on 34th Street when they come in with all the bags of mail and they dump them on the floor and the whole courtroom erupts. You know, it's the scene of pandemonium. It's one of the really colorful and hilarious scenes in the New Testament. Not the only one. I mean, it's really great when they lower Paul out the window in a basket. Anyway, so this is something that grows in time, and what you're seeing here is you're seeing a relatively early form of this intuition. It's just not been fleshed out yet. But Job is the mouthpiece for the author to express that intuition to the Jewish audience reading it. So remember, there's that literary level too. This is not only we're not only looking at this from within the story of what's happening to Job and between the characters, but we always have to keep in the back of our mind the audience that this was intended to be reading it and the lessons they're supposed to be drawing out of it as well. And so for the Jewish audience that's reading this, which is much, much later than Job himself, who is set in the time of Abraham's great-grandchildren, this is being read by people much, much later. And so that intuition, that sense is being inculcated in them through the reading of Job. Did we actually answer that question? So the hope that Job expresses in this chapter is that there could be life. That perhaps it's not the end. That maybe like a tree when man is cut down to the roots, all the way down to the ground, perhaps a shoot might still bud forth. And that's a really beautiful image. A beautiful image of because trees are so beautiful in and of themselves. You know, it's a beautiful that we have these for you out there in Facebook land. There is not far from here at the church a beautiful park with a grove of beautiful live oaks, and it's really lovely. And I every time I drive past it, I admire them. They recently were doing some development on that property. It's city-owned, and they were going to cut some down to make room for playground equipment and walking paths and some houses. And the trees are so beautiful, but seeing one down, it's terrible. It's just awful to see, even if it's necessary in some way. You just hate to see a tree cut down. They're so beautiful, and it's really shocking. But to see something green and living come out of all of that desolation, that's a really powerful image, and one that really you can feel it. You can feel it on the inside. It's an image that sort of touches you at the visceral level. And so that's the hope. And the way this quality of that hope is got to by that feeling and by that image, and the way you feel that image as you go through it in your mind. You see Tolkien plays on that image really well when he talks about the treason of Saruman. And how Saruman, the greatest of all of the wizards, decides to start his own army to try to take over the world, and he pulls down all of the ancient trees there around his stronghold, and they put that into the movies as well, and it's awful to comprehend. imagine tearing out the redwoods, coming through with enormous, or just blowing them out of the ground. Ugh, I mean, it's terrible. And that's the way Job feels about death. But then to see something beyond that, the possibility of resurrection, that's the quality of his hope, and that's the way he expresses it. And when we feel that, that's the way he's kind of intuiting his way toward some understanding or to some question that he can't quite formulate, to some sense of something yet beyond his vision, beyond his understanding. That's the way he's kind of working his way toward it. That's the quality of that hope. It's very visceral, very intuitive, very deep in his heart, but not something that he can find the words for, not something he has an experience of to draw on. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And this is the way poetry or poetic language is used to speak or think theologically. That's the way it works. And that's how that language can be used to get at a theological truth. Not in a propositional way, but by way of expressing a feeling or an image that helps us to sort of feel our way toward an idea or a truth that we don't understand, but that we can feel somehow. And I don't mean feel emotionally, but some deep intuition hidden in the human heart that needs to be answered. What is Job's hope here personal or general?
Personal. His experience with God, so he's talking about himself.
This is very personal for Job. There may be more general implications, but what Job is really about here is his own experience of suffering and his own experience of loss. And of course, I'm sure, getting back into the very interior level of the story, what's going on in Job's own mind, is not just for his own death and the possibility of life coming out of it, but for all of the loss of his children. And this, that's we tend to forget about them because they don't appear again in the story, except in the mouths of his comforters to suggest that perhaps they did something wicked and needed to be killed off because they had angered God. That's the only time they appear after this. So we tend to forget about them. But Job hasn't forgotten about them. Job, who prayed every day, who offered sacrifices every day on their behalf, hasn't forgotten about his children. And so this question is very personal, but not just personal to him as a living being, but personal to his family, to what he loves, and to what he longs for, and to what he misses. What afterlife intuitions are suggested by Job in this chapter?
Life after death, I guess.
Is very, very general. He doesn't have notions of great halls of feasting with giant bowls of mead and fires in the hearth and lambs on spits, or any of the very vivid and specific ideas about what it means to live after death. And it's all connected to his sense that God is his friend. God is my friend, and this relationship somehow does not end. Somehow, this is not the last word, but they're just the very vaguest things. There's no specificity. And Father Patrick says, one suspects that Job, if he had died at this point in the story, would have finished his life begging, like Goethe, "More light! I can't see. I can feel something, but I can't see anything." So there's a big disconnect between Job's understanding, his knowledge, his reason, and his intuition, what he senses, and the strength of his sense of his friendship with God. He knows that he loves God, and that he's not displeased God. And he feels very strongly still somehow God loves him. And he's angry with God because he didn't understand why this is happening. But he never stops believing that God is just or good. So if God is just and good and God is his friend, then God still must love him. And this can't be the end of everything. This can't be the end of that reality. But I have no idea what's happening, or why things are the way they are, or what the end of it all might mean. It's a very, very vague intuition, and one that doesn't match up between what he feels and what he knows. And Job knows a great deal more than his comforters, and yet his experience is not vast enough yet to begin to suss out an answer to this question: what happens when we die? Moving on to chapter 15. Are there any more questions about 14? Moving on to chapter 15 then. Why is Eliphaz harsh with Job in his second discourse?
He doesn't understand why Job continues to question. And he says, "I gave you the answer. Why do you keep asking questions?"
Right. I've told you already what your problem is.
That's right.
So just fix it now. Just do what I say. And again, we've been over this a couple of times already. So the author of Job is whispering gently in our ear, "Learn something here. Take a lesson. I've already given you the answer. Just follow my instructions. Just fill the prescription, Job. That's all we got to do here." And he's also lost patience. Job's not doing what he wants him to do. Job doesn't seem to be listening to him. Job is continuing to insist on his own righteousness before God, and continuing to say somewhat salty things about God. God who has forsaken him, who has allowed him to suffer, and he wishes he could die, and wishes he'd never been born. And none of this pleases Eliphaz. He just wants him to fix the problem. And he's already decided what that problem is. So, how has Job changed the terms of the discussion that annoys Eliphaz?
Didn't Job stop talking directly to Eliphaz and just started talking to God? I thought he was just kind of like, "Okay, we're done here."
He did that with Zophar at the end of Zophar's discourse. When Zophar was done talking, Job asked a rhetorical question that allowed him to simply ignore all of Zophar's statements and continue.
I have Job's ideas threaten the moral structure of the world.
Job, by ignoring a strict cause and effect relationship between what Job did and what happened to Job, has undermined what they understand as the whole structure of reality here. So now it's not only that Job won't just learn his lesson and say he's sorry and straighten up and get back to life. It's not only that he's not doing what Eliphaz wants him to do, it's that what Job is insisting on, what Job is arguing for, seems to knock the foundations out of the very structure of the universe. So now Job is threatening the whole metaphysical worldview that makes the house stand up.
Job is representing the church in this case, and those guys are the heretics. Those guys are against the
That's
church.
definitely one way you can understand
Our
that.
world today, I mean.
But even in Job, even at the time of the Jewish readers who would be reading this, that's a lesson that you could take, is that Job is undermining a false, oversimplistic, impersonal, mechanistic understanding of God and their relationship with God that needs to be wiped away. And Israel was very prone to this. Israel was very prone to this kind of impersonal, mechanistic kind of wanting things to happen X, Y, Z. And they represent, the comforters represent that. And Job calls that whole system into question. And they don't like that, because it's not just a personal problem. It's now a crisis for everybody, for the whole system. And that's no good. And Eliphaz sees that threat and wants to squash it. We have an order. We have a rule here. The double switch here, the double cut, is that Job hasn't actually defied that rule or that order. Job hasn't actually broken the rule. Job hasn't actually called into question the law that's at play. So the undermining is not actually with the law itself or with the rule or the order. It's with this reduced, diminished, simplified, simplistic, sterile caricature of that order that the comforters are working with that is to be swept away and got rid of.
Maybe drifts into legalism.
That's right. It's a legalistic and simplistic caricature of the religious relationship with God that Job is knocking the foundations out from under here. And that would have or should have been very clear to the Jewish reader. Very clear to the Jewish reader.
There's this one blind guy that Jesus heals. He was born blind. And the disciples asked Jesus, is it because his parents were bad or because he sinned? And Jesus says neither. It's for the glory of God. So Jesus heals the blind guy. And then the Pharisees, Sanhedrin, get a hold of the guy that's healed. And they keep asking him, how did Jesus do this? And they finally get ticked off at him. And they say, get out of here, you were born in sin. They call him a bastard. Which is, incredible bookends, because the story starts out, with the question, did this man sin or his parents? And then the Pharisees conclude the story by saying that the man born blind was sinful. But Jesus says it's not that.
I mean, it's the same thing. They decided, okay, you weren't healed at all. This is a result for the glory. This is a result of your sin or your parents' sin. We're not going to. It is this way. So you see this narrative again play out in the New Testament.
I was just going to say that at the end of chapter 14, Job stops talking about his boils and his own particular problems, and he starts talking about death. We talked about his question about if a man dies, can he live again? So this is tough for Eliphaz because boils were Job's problem, but death is everybody's problem. Mm-hmm. So when he starts doing that, all of a sudden Eliphaz has to deal with it because as I say, we all end up in Job's position sooner or later. So Eliphaz can't deal with that. He turns around and he says, your sinfulness dictates your speech. So you choose crafty language. It shows you right there. His reaction is anger and saying, you're tricking me. You're tricking me. This crafty language that he chooses.
He wants to shut this conversation down.
Yeah.
That's a really good point, that when you take it from boils to death, it's gone from a very personal problem to everybody's problem.
That's right.
That's a wonderful point. Absolutely. So, do you think Job is arrogant in the way he talks to God and the way he talks to his comforters? Does he come across that way to you?
No.
How much patience would you have?
He's a very humble guy. So,
Well,
He's got patience.
I mean, he may not actually have anywhere to go.
true.
He may more or less just be there and without much of an option. But
You know, the thing about Job is that he's devoted to the truth. And so that's one thing is that he won't give up. He won't acknowledge the notion that he must have done something bad. He knows that he's innocent, and he won't give up what he sees as the truth. But the second thing is that getting to this question about arrogance, I don't know if he's arrogant, but he's confident. He's confident that he should be able to understand this. And that's why he keeps asking questions. You know, he won't accept the notion that there's something here that I just can't understand, and therefore I should just do what you tell me to do, and everything's going to be hunky-dory. He says, no, I should be able to understand this. This is the truth, and I should be able to understand it, and I want to talk to God about it.
and this goes back to what Zophar said, which is you can't understand God's wisdom at all. It's just not knowable.
Right?
Whatever God does is wisdom, whether it makes any sense or not. And so wisdom is not even something we can make sense of. So just stop asking. And these are all different ways of trying to shut him down. But he intuits not only is there some reason, but that he could understand it, or that God's wisdom is knowable in some part. That it's not completely bewildering and incomprehensible. So I think you're right. It's not arrogance, but he is definitely confident. I would use the word tenacious. He is not letting go. He is not letting go of his insistence that God come. He's not letting go of his innocence. He is not letting go. He's not just shut down. You know, his comforters keep talking. I would have just stopped talking. I'd have been, but he just keeps letting him have it. I mean, his statement at the beginning of chapter 12 is just wonderfully witty. Wisdom will die with you all. So he's very, very confident. He's gonna stick it out. He is devoted to the truth. That's absolutely right. Last question for today. In what ways are Eliphaz and Job's perspectives similar?
Well, they both believe that God ultimately will be just. So Eliphaz says, well, God is just, and you just messed up and you won't admit it. And that's why you're being punished. So he believes that God is just. Job also believes that God is just, except that he knows that he's innocent. And he doesn't understand the justice. He believes that there's justice there, but he doesn't understand it, and he wants to talk it out, and he wants to understand it. But eventually, he believes in the ultimate justice of God.
And both he and Eliphaz believe that it's not possible to demand an accounting of God.
That's true.
That in some degree God is always beyond us. That we can't exhaust him. We can't come to the bottom of his wisdom or understand or comprehend everything about him or what he does. That we are altogether subsistent. That we depend upon him, that he's greater than us, more powerful, however you want to say it. And that we can't call him to court and appeal to a law outside of God by which God could be judged. And that we could be found innocent by an appeal to some third power. Like we do in our legal system. We come before the law and whoever else, and it's the law, this impersonal third power, that settles it, at least theoretically. So they both believe that God is more powerful and is in some sense beyond us. They also both believe that God will ultimately restore Job. The difference between the two of them is that Job's experience of God is deeper, more personal, and that Job is willing to make room here for a mystery. That there's something going on that none of them has quite figured out, and they don't know what it is, but that they can figure it out. And Eliphaz is confident that that's not the case. And he's not only confident that's not the case, he really, really, on a visceral level, wants it not to be the case. He needs it not to be the case. Because Job is starting to rock the foundations of his entire understanding of the world, and the conversation is beginning to turn in a way that threatens his own sense of well-being. And that is no good for Eliphaz. Any last questions or comments about?
I think it's again only just, pops up in my mind. It's like a faithful person dealing with unfaithful person. Worldviews, Job is very faithful, has experienced God, he knows God, he loves God, he offered to God. And other people, legal system or maybe worldview system. So two ends are talking to each other, one with the faith and one without faith, one with knowing God, one without knowledge of God.
And there's a whole spectrum here. It goes from Eliphaz, who's pretty close. He has an experience of God and some direct knowledge. From Bildad, who has this inherited wisdom that he's pretty conversant in, but no experience. Down to Zophar, who's just he's memorized the cliches, but he doesn't have any deep understanding of them. He's just full of cliches and trite sayings that allow him to skim along on the surface. And this is the full range of the possibility of our experience with God. And yet, at the fullest possible end, there is something still that Job does not know. So, that does it for this week. Next week we will read 16, 17, 18, and 19. 16 through 19. God willing, we'll see you all then. God bless you. Bye-bye.